couple of kids chasing after their dog fell down a hole, sort of an Alice in Wonderland story, and found the Hall of the Bulls in Lascaux, France. And this is also from the Paleolithic period. And the Hall of the Bulls is probably the most significant picture gallery. It shows a whole bunch of animals overlapped, painting on walls. And this cave painting that we're looking at, there are several interpretations of why it exists, but I think first what we need to do is look at how it's painted and address the formal concerns of how these things actually look. Because if we do a close analysis of how they look visually, then maybe we can actually figure out what they mean in terms of that. The first thing we need to look at is how they're organized in terms of space or composition in terms of the picture plane. There's not a lot of individual space around each one of the animals. There's no overall composition planned in terms of the paintings themselves. It seems rather haphazard, and it also doesn't seem as if there's meant to be the illusion of space or depth. That means that the picture plane was not initially planned, and most likely these paintings were overlapped over several hundreds of years, where people would come back to this site and keep drawing these animals on the walls. The animals that are on the walls seem to be prehistoric horses, also bison, and other animals that might be considered useful for food. When we zoom in on the paintings and we look at these individual paintings, and we're looking at one from Lascaux and one from Altamira, I think that the most important thing is to see that these paintings are painted, first of all, in profile views. And the reason for that probably is because when you paint something in profile, it's more identifiable. It's also easier to paint something in profile. For instance, some of the first drawings that kids do are often faces in profile. When you draw a face in a frontal view, it's harder to identify who that person is, but the contours of a nose make sense. So the same thing probably is evidenced in the cave paintings of Lascaux and Altamira. The next thing we need to talk about is how they're painted and the sort of technique that's used. So let's address it first in terms of the lines that are being used. It seems like initially what the cave painters were doing, where they did a sort of outline, and then they would use colors to fill in and to provide a little bit of shading and to show some of the musculature of the animals. And the pigments that they used were most likely charcoal, manganese, ochres, ferrous oxides, and those pigments are basically naturally occurring metals or ores. Charcoal you can get from a fire pit. The way that they got them to adhere is either you'd mix it with water and it would make a sort of watercolor, or you might also add as the vehicle or medium a animal fat, which would make it stick, in essentially making a sort of oil painting. And that's how they would have made these things stick to the walls. There isn't really much attention paid to light and shadow. There's not a light source. There's no what we call chiaroscuro or shading across the figures. It's just a diagrammatic expression of the animal itself. And we're not really sure why these animals are painted on there, but we'll address the reasons why they did them in a little bit. When first we look at Lascaux, we're going to take a look at the context of how Lascaux was founded and why it was preserved for so long, because I think that's also kind of like Altamira. It's an important set of facts that you might find interesting and also satisfy some of my curiosity. When these kids found the cave, it was partially uncovered. As you can see in 1940, it was just a small opening. In the Paleolithic era, it was an open entrance that probably was a long hallway that led down into this place that was gradually covered over by sediment and by erosion. And essentially, the cave itself was sealed, and caves are unique in that usually the temperature is very consistent and the humidity is very consistent in the caves. These days, I don't think you can go into Lascaux anymore, because if you do, the humidity from your breath will cause funguses to cause on the pigments and on the rocks, and it'll eat away the cave paintings. But these kids were lucky enough to find it. So they walked in, and these two photographs show what the entrance looked like and the scale of what it looked like as well. The cave is a very long structure and has several rooms in it. Probably the most important room is the Hall of the Bulls, and then another piece that we're going to be looking at inside one of the smaller chambers off to the side is the bird-headed man with the bison and the rhinoceros. So let's talk about the Hall of the Bulls first. As we noticed before, all of the images were overlapped. It probably means that they came in over a period of time and overlapped the paintings themselves over time, and the reason why those animals are being shown are they're either foodstuffs or animals that had power that people wanted to have. And just like paintings on the walls of churches, paintings on the walls of kivas, paintings on the walls of religious institutions in general, it's reasonable, not necessarily proven, to assume that these caves were actually almost sacred places where people would go and they would paint on the walls animals that they hoped to have some sort of link to, either with sympathetic magic, or that they were hoping that by making an effigy of the animal, almost like a voodoo doll, they would be able to hunt this animal and control it. So that's kind of a reasonable explanation of why they're overlapped like that, why there's no attention to space, and why it's in the space that it is. But they could have painted paintings like this on the walls of their structures, and we just have no way of knowing because all those things would have disappeared and would have rotted over time. So we need to look at the iconography of what we know about fairly historical and contemporary cultures and apply it to what we know about Lascaux and about prehistoric Paleolithic painting. Remember this stuff? Remember the Yei spirits that we looked at that were the Anasazi and Navajo, that they were sort of like little creatures or spirits that went back and forth between the spiritual world and the physical world, and they also had some sort of influence. Also, there are depictions of hands in a lot of paintings in most cultures, and hands represent a human presence. I have my hand on it. I've got my finger on it. That kind of cliche applies to this as well. So when we look at these paintings, they probably are representations of things that either were historical, stories, or things that they hoped would happen. When we zoom in on this wounded bison attacking a man, and that's just the title that history books give it, we don't really know if it's actually a wounded bison attacking a man. However, if you look closer at the picture, you'll see that the bison has its guts pouring out. Those are his intestines coming out of the bottom. And then we see this man laying on the ground, and he has sort of a bird head on him. It could be a mask. It also just could be that's how they drew heads. And then what I call a chicken on a stick, a bird on a stick. And then there are several arrows around it. It also looks like he has an erection or a penis sheath on the end of his penis. It's possible that when we look at other cultures, for instance, the culture of the Australian Aborigine and in Papua New Guinea, they do wear ornaments like this to make their genitals look larger, and that makes them look tougher. Sort of like how some young tough guys will actually touch their genitals as a way to show that they have them, I guess. Also, the bird on the stick could be a representation of some sort of shaman's rattle. It could be some sort of magical stick that gives them the power of the bird. And we also see scattered around the bison and the man are these arrow-like forms that could be representations of spears. So this could be not someone who's on the ground, but someone who just slew the bison and is standing by it, because we don't know what the conventions of visual illusion were at this point in time. The next cave we're going to look at is kind of an interesting cave because it shows the human hand. This cave in Cosquer, France, was found actually by some scuba divers who were going caving. It's sort of a form of spelunking where they dive under the water and then they come up into caves that have water in them, and they found these sort of spray painted hands on the walls. And if you come closer to the hands, you'll see that some of the hands are actually missing fingers. Now, let's talk about first how we think that they might have made these hands. The hands might have been made by actually simply holding your hand up against the wall, taking a reed, and chewing up some charcoal or some kind of pigment, and then spraying it through, almost like a spitball, around the hand. Now, that doesn't explain why the hands are missing fingers. Some possible explanations for why the hands are missing fingers could be closely related to things like, for instance, the Yakuza that we know about from Japan. When someone screws up, they have to take a finger. Also, offering a part of your body or making a sacrifice, for instance, a tattoo, or hurting yourself in some way. In the Mayan culture, they actually would let go of some of their blood. They would injure themselves and then burn the blood. Maybe taking some of the fingers off was a sacrifice in order to accomplish something. The hand could also mean that I was here. There's also another possible explanation that it's very easy to lose fingers when you're trying to fight a wild animal and when you're killing animals. And at a time when they didn't have caves, when they didn't have weapons, they might have actually lost fingers in battles with animals or with each other. The other possible explanation is maybe they just had fists made when they were blowing the paint around them. Now, if we look closely at this comparison of the cave painting from Lascaux and we look at the painting from the Anasazi culture, I think there are a couple of things that you'll see that they have in common. First of all, there are animals, and the animals are animals that would have been naturally occurring in their environment. They also at times hold staves or spears. There are bird images associated with people, and there are people that have regalia on or costumes on that indicate power. And the point in me making this comparison between the two cultures is that possibly these two cultures were not so far removed from each other in terms of their motivations, their desires. I think that all human beings pretty much are driven by very similar things. And I think that it's very important to acknowledge that what we've learned about earlier cultures that we know from the historic era, for instance, the Navajo, the Kwakawakawak or Kwakiutl and Haida cultures, and the Hopi culture might help us to decipher at least some of the possible reasons why these cave paintings existed and how they came about. It also explains why the paintings were so diagrammatic, because they might have been used to clearly communicate ideas.